You know what's wild? The most famous spy of World War I might not have actually spied at all. Her weapon wasn't a gun, it was a gaze, and apparently that was dangerous enough to terrify governments. Meet Mata Hari, exotic dancer, high society heartbreaker, and the woman accused of selling France's secrets through the art of a good flirt. She claimed she was misunderstood. They claimed she was a traitor, and somewhere between the lies and the lingerie, a legend was born. So tonight, let's dim the lights, sip some tea, and unravel how one woman went from dancing on stage to dying before a firing squad. If you grew up in a small European town in the late 1800s, your life was pretty much decided the moment you were born. You'd either inherit the family shop, marry someone equally unimpressed by you, or die of boredom before your 30th birthday. But Margaretha Zell wasn't built for that kind of predictability. She was born in Leeuwarden, a respectable Dutch town where the most exciting scandal was someone buying 2 cows instead of 1. From the start, she wanted more. Not just more money or more love, more everything. The kind of more that made the local church frown and her father beam proudly. Because yes, that's my little troublemaker. Her father, Adam Zell, was the type of man who made a fortune selling hats and promptly spent it pretending he was royalty. He spoiled Margaretha rotten. Silk ribbons, fancy schools, carriage rides through town, until reality showed up like an overdue bill. His business collapsed, her parents divorced, and suddenly the family who once threw dinner parties couldn't afford dinner. You could say it was her first lesson in illusion. Wealth looks real until it isn't. The fall from luxury hit harder than expected. Margaretha's mother fell ill. Her father vanished into another life, and she was left with the gray weight of survival. The town's gossip mill churned at full speed, whispering about the girl who used to ride in carriages now walking to work. Nothing quite builds a performer like humiliation, and Margaretha learned fast that if you can't silence the whispers, you outshine them. By her teenage years, she had developed a certain awareness. She knew eyes followed her. Her beauty wasn't the quiet kind. It was theatrical. She could make an entire room inhale at once just by adjusting her hat. It was her first taste of control, and it was intoxicating. The men of Leeuwarden might have called it temptation, but Margaretha called it leverage. Small-town morality, after all, is just envy in fancier clothes. When she enrolled at a teacher training college, she probably imagined a sensible future. Respectable job, small house, maybe a cat. Then the headmaster decided to personally mentor her, which is history's polite way of saying gross misconduct. Rumors exploded. The school expelled her. Once again, reputation devoured opportunity. In a world built to contain her, she was already too much. Too bold. Too seen. And honestly, too smart to stay trapped in a place that punished visibility. By 18, she was restless, like a spark looking for dry wood. Europe was changing, and so was she. The streets were filled with uniforms, posters, and promises of adventure. Somewhere between the hum of train engines and the scent of foreign letters, she found her escape. A newspaper advertisement from a Dutch army officer seeking a wife. His name was Rudolf MacLeod, and he lived in the Dutch East Indies. A soldier, a steady income, and an ocean away from judgment. What could possibly go wrong? But before we get there, let's pause on Margaretha herself. Imagine her sitting by the window that evening, ink-stained fingers holding the ad, trying to picture this stranger who could be her future. Maybe she smiled at the thought of adventure. Maybe she just didn't want to die in the same town that had already buried her dreams. Either way, that letter she wrote in reply would change her life more than any passport ever could. Because when she mailed that letter, she wasn't really sending words. She was sending a version of herself. Confident, mysterious, desirable. The kind of woman who could make a man cross oceans. It was her first act of performance, long before the stage lights of Paris. The script was still rough, but the role, already forming. It's easy to look back and judge her decisions. To say she should have stayed home, or found a safer way to survive. But the truth is, people don't dream rationally when their world feels small. They dream dramatically because hope is the only rebellion left when everything else has failed. And Margaretha was nothing if not dramatic. There's something quietly tragic about how early she understood the mechanics of illusion. When the men in her life failed her, her father with his bankruptcy, the school with its hypocrisy, she didn't cry victim. She studied the game and decided to play it better. If the world rewarded beauty over honesty, then beauty would become her weapon. If people only listened when she performed, then performance would be her language. She wasn't running from herself. She was constructing someone new, someone untouchable, someone like Mata Hari. But she wasn't there yet. Not quite. For now, she was still Margaretha, a clever girl in a world that didn't know what to do with clever girls. She'd soon step onto a ship bound for a life she couldn't predict, armed with little more than charm, hope, and a dangerous curiosity about how far illusion could take her. And somewhere, maybe deep down, she already knew that pretending to be someone else might just be the only way to survive being herself. And soon, her first escape would come wearing a military uniform and a promise. If Margaretha's life had been a movie, this is where the soundtrack would shift. Violins swelling, steam rising from the dock. A wide shot of a young woman boarding a ship bound for destiny. Unfortunately, destiny had the emotional availability of wet toast. His name was Captain Rudolph MacLeod, and he was twice her age, twice her height, and maybe half as self-aware. He looked like the kind of man who ironed his mustache but not his morals. Still, he wore a uniform, and that was enough to make him look like salvation to a woman who'd spent her life trying to escape her own reflection. Their romance began in the least romantic way possible, through the Dutch version of mail-order brides weekly. Letters full of polite compliments, a few exotic promises, and an unspoken transaction. He'd provide security. She'd provide admiration. It was 1895's answer to Tinder, except with longer shipping times and significantly worse customer service. When Margaretha stepped off the ship in Amsterdam to meet him, she was probably expecting a gentleman. What she got was a man who bragged about his military career between gulps of gin. But beggars can't be choosers, and Margaretha was tired of begging. For respect, for freedom, for the chance to be anyone but that scandalous girl from Leeuwarden. So she smiled, nodded, and agreed to marry him. They wed fast, too fast, the kind of fast that only desperation or very poor judgment can justify. Within months, she was on another ship, this time heading east to the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. The journey took weeks. Imagine her, standing at the rail, wind in her hair, pretending this was adventure and not escape. Every wave between Europe and Asia was a whisper saying, "Don't look back." When they arrived, the colonies must have felt like another planet. The air hung heavy with spice and heat, a place where sunsets looked painted and mosquitoes outnumbered dreams. The officers' wives spent their days gossiping over tea while servants moved like shadows in the background. To survive in colonial society was to perform, to smile through loneliness, to pretend the paradise wasn't rotting from within. And Margaretha? She adapted. Quickly. She wore local fabrics, learned local dances, and charmed the other wives with her confidence. Her husband, on the other hand, was unraveling faster than a cheap uniform. Between his drinking, jealousy, and violent outbursts, domestic bliss became domestic warfare. He cheated. She retaliated with silence and style. It was the kind of toxic relationship that could power a reality show today. Then came tragedy, the kind that doesn't need embellishment. Their two children, Norman and Nan, fell ill. The tropical heat turned fevers deadly, and when Norman died, something in Margaretha broke permanently. She blamed her husband's negligence. He blamed everyone else. There are some losses so profound they drain the color out of everything after, and that was hers. She left him soon after, taking her surviving daughter and whatever pieces of herself were still intact. Divorce, especially in that era, was like social suicide. But at this point, she'd already died once, the hopeful version of her. What was one more burial? When she returned to Europe, the world felt different. Maybe it was her, maybe it was the weight of everything she'd endured. She was older, sharper, quieter. Her beauty had matured from soft radiance into something more dangerous, the kind of allure that made people curious, even nervous. You could see it in her eyes. the look of someone who had seen paradise and called its bluff. She tried briefly to live a normal life, but normal had expired. Respectability was gone, money was thin, and reputation? Well, that had been drowned somewhere between Java and Amsterdam. She modeled hats, taught German, even posed for artists who didn't bother pretending it was about the art. But through it all, there was a simmering sense of waiting, like a spotlight had been left on somewhere, just for her. And then something strange happened. She started to perform. Not on a stage, not yet, but in her manner, in her walk, her voice, the way she told stories about her time in the East. To some, it sounded like fantasy. To others, it was intoxicating. She began experimenting with identity the way an artist tests color, layering myth over memory until even she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. That's the thing about trauma. It doesn't just scar you. It teaches you to shapeshift. Margaretha understood instinctively that survival wasn't about truth. It was about presentation. The right story, told beautifully enough, could open any door. And if the world insisted on misunderstanding her, she'd at least give them something worth misunderstanding. Sometimes I wonder what she thought, looking in the mirror in those years. Did she recognize herself? Or did she already see the outline of someone else? Someone with sharper cheekbones, darker eyes, and a name that meant Eye of the Day. Because soon, the audiences of Paris would know her not as the discarded wife of a soldier, but as Mata Hari, the woman who would turn illusion into art and art into infamy. And as for Captain Rudolph MacLeod, he faded into the footnotes of her legend, another man who mistook control for power. History would remember her name long after his dissolved in gin and dust. It's strange how escape can turn into another kind of prison. But for Margaretha, every prison came with a stage door. And when she walked through the next one, it would open into a theater glowing with gaslight and lies. And when she came back to Europe, she wasn't Margaretha anymore. She was someone else entirely. Paris, 1905, the city was drunk on itself. Gas lamps shimmered off wet cobblestones. Carriages rattled through boulevards that smelled of perfume and horse manure. And the Eiffel Tower still looked like an awkward teenager of steel. This was a place where artists starved beautifully, politicians sinned publicly, and everyone pretended to understand abstract art. Into this dazzling chaos walked a woman who didn't quite belong anywhere. Margaretha Zell, 29 years old, divorced, broke, but with enough poise to look like she owned the room. Paris was good at swallowing dreamers. It ate them alive, digested them into waitresses, muses, or mistresses. But Margaretha had something that refused to be ordinary, a kind of self-awareness wrapped in theater. She'd seen enough of human nature to realize one truth. If you can't have power, you can at least have attention. And attention, in the early 1900s, was the new currency. One night, at a small gathering filled with men who thought themselves gods and women who knew better, Margaretha performed an improvised dance. It wasn't classical ballet or proper theater. It was something slower, stranger. She moved with deliberate grace, each gesture unfolding like a secret. By the time she stopped, the room was silent. The silence of fascination. The kind of silence that pays rent. When someone asked her name, she didn't say Margaretha. That name was gone, buried in the wreckage of her old life. Instead, she said, Mata Hari. It rolled off her tongue like a spell. In Malay, she explained, it meant Eye of the Day, the sun itself. Was that true? Absolutely not. But in a world obsessed with the exotic and the mysterious, accuracy was less profitable than mystique. And just like that, a myth stepped into the light. Her performances became the talk of Paris. She claimed to be a priestess of an ancient Eastern temple, performing sacred dances that symbolized birth, love, and death. Translation: she was very good at making men think sin was culture. Her shows blended slow motion with suggestion, silk veils with silence. The audience wasn't watching a striptease, they were watching a ritual. Or at least that's what they told themselves to justify the ticket price. She understood what every great performer knows. It's not about truth, it's about belief. The moment you convince people they're witnessing something authentic, they'll hand you their money and their souls. and Mata Hari was a master of that delicate illusion. Journalists described her as a goddess of the Orient, the embodiment of mystery, and the most dangerous woman in Europe. It didn't matter that she was Dutch. The idea of her was too captivating to ruin with geography. Paris didn't want reality, it wanted fantasy. And Mata Hari delivered night after night. Behind the scenes, though, she lived in rented rooms and borrowed luxury. The furs were real, but the bank account wasn't. The jewels sparkled, but the debts did too. Still, she knew how to play the game. She cultivated powerful admirers, diplomats, generals, men with titles and secrets. She became fluent in charm the way others learned languages. Every smile was calculated, every glance a negotiation. You could say she was an early influencer before Instagram and filters. Only her filters were veils and incense smoke. When she walked into a room, conversation stopped, not because people respected her, but because they wanted to consume her. And she let them because attention was survival. There's something quietly tragic about that, isn't there? That a woman who built her power on illusion could never afford to drop the act. Beneath the layers of performance, there was still a person who'd lost a child, escaped abuse, and reinvented herself from ashes. But vulnerability doesn't sell tickets, mystery does. Sometimes, after a performance, she'd retire to her dressing room, the scent of sweat and perfume still clinging to the air, and stare into the mirror, just for a moment, before the next admirer knocked. Maybe she wondered who she really was under the makeup, or maybe she was too afraid to find out. Still, she was unstoppable. By 1906, Mata Hari was performing across Europe, Vienna, Berlin, Madrid. Every city wanted a taste of the legend. Critics compared her to a living statue. Audiences described her as hypnotic. Even royalty attended. The Prince of Wales, the Crown Prince of Germany, they all watched her with the same expression. Fascination mixed with danger. She had become exactly what she'd always wanted, unforgettable. And yet, fame has a way of turning the spotlight into a magnifying glass. The higher she climbed, the more fragile her footing became. Jealous rivals whispered that her dances were vulgar, that she wasn't a real artist. Others claimed she was an escort wrapped in silk. And maybe, on some level, she was both and neither. Every era has its influencers, hers just wore veils instead of filters. She sold fantasy, and the public bought it eagerly, because everyone wants to believe in something a little too beautiful to be real. But fame, like fire, doesn't just illuminate, it burns. And somewhere, beneath the glow of applause and champagne, Mata Hari must have sensed the flicker of danger in the distance. A war on the horizon, a world about to tear itself apart. For now, though, Paris adored her. The music swelled, the crowd gasped, and she danced like she was holding the sun in her hands. The illusion was perfect, the timing exquisite, and outside the theater doors, history was waiting, sharpening its knives. By 1910, Paris was a pressure cooker. One big, sweaty cocktail of art, gossip, and anxiety. The city was obsessed with decadence, as if everyone sensed the world was about to collapse and decided to throw one last glittering party before it did. Cabarets pulsed with violins, absinthe turned conversation into confession, and in smoky corners of Montmartre, poets swore they'd found God inside a bottle. And right in the middle of this sensual apocalypse was Mata Hari, shimmering, untouchable, and just a little too good to be real. Her shows were sold out months in advance. The press compared her to Cleopatra, Salome, and occasionally to a religious experience, if religion wore fewer clothes. She'd arrive at theaters draped in silk, accompanied by her pet monkeys and a perfume so rich it probably violated economic laws. The Guémet Museum even invited her to perform as part of its Sacred Eastern Rituals exhibition, which, if you think about it, is an incredible euphemism for slow, elegant undressing. The audience didn't care. They were hungry for escape, and she fed them stories disguised as dances. One performance might depict the Hindu goddess Shiva, another the tragic seduction of a warrior. No one questioned her authenticity. It was the age of Orientalism, when Europe believed every mystery east of Greece involved forbidden temples and too much eyeliner. Mata Hari played into it perfectly. She'd learned the art of pacing, the way to make a crowd lean forward, breath held, as if one more second of stillness would break them. It wasn't just erotic, it was psychological warfare. She'd stand motionless for a full minute, then lift one hand, and the entire room would sigh. That kind of control is addictive and dangerous. Behind closed doors, her life was even more dramatic. She moved in circles of diplomats, generals, and billionaires' sons. The same men who applauded her on stage now sent her diamonds, cars, and very bad poetry. She wasn't naive. She knew their attention came with expectations. But Mata Hari had no intention of being anyone's possession. She was collecting information, even if she didn't yet realize how valuable that habit would become. She was also collecting lovers. Some lasted weeks, others a night. But each one added to the legend, the exotic temptress who could hypnotize men into madness. In truth, she probably just listened to them talk about themselves, which works just as well. Still, the rumor mill painted her as both divine and dangerous. A living fantasy wrapped in scandal. And with fame came imitation. Dozens of dancers tried to replicate her act. Some copied her movements, others stole her name. One even called herself Little Mata Hari, which sounds less like flattery and more like a questionable circus act. But no one could replicate the original because her power wasn't in the choreography. It was in the illusion that she believed her own myth. But here's the dark irony. Fame makes you visible, and visibility makes you vulnerable. The same newspapers that once worshipped her began to turn. Critics sniffed that her act was tired, that she'd lost her mystery. A younger generation of performers, less mysterious but more scandalous, began taking her spotlight. And when the money ran out, the champagne did too. Still, she refused to fade quietly. She reinvented herself, new costumes, new stories, new lovers. Reinvention was her religion. She'd smile through humiliation, flirt through anxiety, and dance through heartbreak. Beneath the silk and confidence, though, was someone terrified of becoming irrelevant. And then came 1914. Europe began to crack. News spread that an Austrian archduke had been shot in Sarajevo, and suddenly every cafe conversation turned into a war prophecy. Within weeks, the world was unrecognizable. Borders closed, armies mobilized, and Paris, once drunk on pleasure, sobered up in fear. Mata Hari watched the shift happen in real time. Her audience disappeared, either drafted or too broke to buy tickets. The theaters grew quiet, replaced by military parades. The glittering salons became echo chambers of gossip and suspicion. For a woman who thrived on attention, silence was terrifying. To make things worse, she was a foreigner, a Dutch citizen, technically neutral, performing in France while sleeping with German officers. Subtlety was never her strong suit. And in a paranoid wartime climate, being glamorous and multilingual was practically a confession. She started traveling again, taking shows in neutral countries like Spain and the Netherlands, performing for anyone who could still afford to forget the war for a few hours. But the borders were tighter now. Every train ride meant questioning. Every hotel stay meant watchful eyes. Her letters were opened, her lovers interrogated, her name whispered in political offices that had never seen her dance. Paris had loved her when love was harmless. Now that same allure looked suspicious. When a woman that beautiful walks between nations, people start wondering what she's carrying, and it's never just perfume. Still, there's something admirable in how she kept performing, even as the world unraveled, like a candle refusing to admit it's melting. She wasn't just selling fantasy anymore. She was living it to survive. But even the best illusions can't outshine war. Soon, her audiences wouldn't be made of champagne-soaked aristocrats, but of men in uniforms. Men who didn't clap at the end because they were taking notes. She had no idea yet that her next curtain call would be in a courtroom. But when Europe caught fire in 1914, her audience changed, and so did the stakes. When the world finally lost its mind in 1914, Paris felt it first. The same boulevards that once overflowed with laughter and cabaret smoke now echoed with marching boots and fear. Posters of glamorous actresses were torn down and replaced with posters screaming, "Enlist now!" Champagne bottles gave way to tin helmets, and every piano player suddenly had a brother missing at the front. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning color into grayscale overnight. And right in the middle of this transformation stood Mata Hari, the woman who had built her empire on fantasy, suddenly trapped in a reality that had no use for it. Her usual crowd, generals, diplomats, bored aristocrats, were now too busy losing battles to attend soirees. The theaters went dark, the audience vanished, and the only thing that sold faster than gossip was fear. Overnight, every foreigner became a suspect, and Mata Hari? She was the most foreign woman in Paris. Dutch by birth, fluent in German and French, comfortable in every language except silence. She fit the description of a spy a little too well. The irony was cruel. The same traits that once made her irresistible, her mystery, her confidence, her network of powerful lovers, now looked like evidence. She wasn't dangerous because of what she did. She was dangerous because of what people imagined she could do. To make matters worse, her career was collapsing faster than the French front line. The newspapers that once called her a goddess now mocked her as the dancer who danced too long. Her savings dwindled, her jewels were pawned, and her admirers vanished like smoke. She moved between hotels, from Paris to The Hague to Madrid, still trying to perform, still pretending that the applause would come back if she just kept smiling. But there was a shift, a kind of survival instinct that took over. She started using her charm not just to entertain, but to negotiate. Tickets became meetings. Flirtation became strategy. And somewhere in that blur of desperation and confidence, she began crossing paths with the kind of men who had actual secrets to tell. Picture it. Candlelight dinners with officers, whispered conversations over expensive wine, the air thick with perfume and paranoia. She probably didn't think of it as espionage, just another dance, another illusion. But when nations panic, beauty becomes dangerous. And Mata Hari was still stunning. Even in her late 30s, she carried herself like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, which, paradoxically, made her look even guiltier to the people who thought she didn't belong. Then came the letters. Always the letters. The kind written in elegant cursive on stationery that smelled faintly of musk and risk. Men who should have known better wrote her confessions, troop movements, political gossip. To them, she was a fantasy. To intelligence officers, she was a liability. Her name began to circulate in military offices. Mata Hari, possible German contact. Mata Hari, observed with known spies. It didn't matter whether any of it was true. In wartime, truth is just a rumor with good timing. Still, she tried to keep her footing. She danced occasionally for charity events, claiming to raise funds for soldiers. She flirted with diplomats who looked at her as both temptation and threat. She told friends she was doing her part for peace, though no one knew exactly what that meant. Probably not even her. The truth was simpler. She was broke, aging, and losing relevance. The fantasy she'd built for herself, the exotic goddess untouchable by consequence, was cracking. And when her world started to fall apart, she reached for the only thing she'd ever been good at, making people believe. By 1916, whispers about her activities reached the French Counterintelligence Bureau. That's when Georges Ledoux entered her story, a man whose job was to catch spies and whose hobby, apparently, was recruiting glamorous disasters. He was sharp, ambitious, and thought he could manipulate Mata Hari into working for France. He invited her to lunch. She arrived, dressed like a queen who'd misplaced her throne. He offered her a proposition. Spy for France. Use your charm, your access, your contacts. Seduce enemy officers. Bring us secrets. Simple, right? She probably laughed, the same kind of laugh you give when someone suggests you can fix your finances with crypto. But then she paused. Maybe it was the money. Maybe it was the chance to be useful again. Maybe she just liked the sound of being important. Whatever the reason, she agreed. She'd always been a performer, and espionage, she thought, couldn't be that different. You play a role, you memorize lines, you improvise when cornered. The difference is, in the theater, bad acting gets you bad reviews. In espionage, bad acting gets you shot. But how could she know that yet? To her, it was just another illusion to master. As she left the cafe that day, Paris looked different. Colder, heavier, alive with suspicion. The same city that once worshipped her now watched her from behind curtains. She didn't realize it yet, but she had just signed up for the final act of her life. And somewhere, in some dimly lit office, a French officer wrote her name down in ink next to one word, Agent. The irony was delicious and devastating. The woman who made her living pretending was about to become the most famous pretend spy in history. Then came a man named Ledoux, and with him a proposition Mata couldn't refuse. By 1916, the Great War Machine had turned Europe into a meat grinder with nicer uniforms. Everyone was spying on everyone. Diplomats, maids, priests, carrier pigeons, and the lines between hero, traitor, and idiot blurred daily. So when Georges Ledoux, head of French counterintelligence, slid an envelope across the cafe table toward Mata Hari, it felt less like recruitment and more like fate finally calling collect. He was charming in that bureaucratic, self-serious way, the kind of man who polished his spectacles before telling you he didn't trust anyone. He spoke in riddles about patriotism and honor while eyeing her like a valuable chess piece. The proposal was simple on paper. You'll work for France, travel across borders, dine with the enemy, bring us what they reveal, payment upon results. Mata Hari stared at him through a haze of cigarette smoke, probably wondering if this was espionage or just another one of those dinner invitations that ended in regret. But she was running out of options and running out of patrons faster. Her income had evaporated. Her reputation was half mud, half myth, and she'd long since pawned anything that glittered. France wanted a spy. She needed money. Deal. The only catch: Mata Hari didn't actually know how to be a spy. She thought of espionage the way most people think of theater. Glamorous, thrilling, maybe involving secret signals and champagne in hotel rooms. No one had told her about the paperwork, the paranoia, the code names that made you sound like a cartoon villain. Still, she accepted. Maybe she believed she could charm her way through it. After all, hadn't charm kept her alive this long? Her first mission was supposed to be in Belgium, infiltrating German officers stationed there. In reality, it meant traveling through multiple checkpoints, surviving interrogations, and not accidentally flirting with someone who carried handcuffs for a living. She was given a small advance, about 20,000 francs, and a promise that more would follow. That kind of money could have bought her a small palace or, at the very least, a month's worth of sanity. The French military sent her to neutral Spain first, under the pretense of performing. It was the perfect cover. Who questions a dancer when the world is on fire? But the thing about pretending to be a spy is that people start taking you seriously. Within days, German agents stationed in Madrid noticed her, the way she moved, the company she kept, the conversations she seemed to overhear by accident. And that's when everything got messy. German intelligence, always eager for chaos, decided to recruit her too. They called her Agent H21, offered money, promised protection. Mata Hari, ever the pragmatist, didn't say no. She probably thought she could play both sides, collect both paychecks, and retire somewhere warm before anyone figured it out. To her, this wasn't treason, it was survival with better branding. But in the world of espionage, dual loyalties are like juggling grenades, impressive right up until one goes off. Ledoux, meanwhile, began to suspect she wasn't entirely loyal. It's unclear if he truly believed she was a double agent, or if he simply found her convenient. Either way, every step she took from then on was being watched, by both sides. The dancer who once commanded crowds now had an audience she couldn't see. What makes this part of her story tragic isn't her greed or ambition. It's her ignorance. Mata Hari had no idea how high the stakes really were. The telegrams she sent were intercepted, decoded, and misinterpreted by men who'd never met her but decided she was dangerous anyway. To them, she wasn't a confused performer caught between nations. She was the perfect villain. Foreign, beautiful, independent, and easy to blame. Still, she kept performing her role. In Madrid, she dined with German officers, gathering gossip disguised as flirtation. She sent Ledoux notes filled with scraps of information, troop rumors, coded names, anything that sounded important. To a professional spy, her intel would have been laughable. But to Ledoux, desperate for results and headlines, it was enough to keep her on the leash. You almost have to admire her confidence. The way she carried herself at embassy parties, all mystery and perfume, as if she really was the secret weapon France imagined. Maybe part of her believed it. After all, when your whole life has been a performance, sincerity is just another costume. But the illusion was fraying. Her letters grew more anxious, her money ran out again, and every border crossing became a gamble. She complained to friends that French intelligence owed her for services rendered. She bragged about being the greatest spy in the world. She was, unknowingly, writing her own epitaph. Because by 1917, France's patience was gone. The war was bleeding them dry, morale was collapsing, and they needed a scapegoat. Someone glamorous enough to distract the newspapers from the word defeat. And Mata Hari, with her veils, her foreign accent, and her fatal timing, was practically volunteering. Still, it's worth pausing here, just for a breath. Imagine her sitting in some lavish hotel room, the noise of distant artillery rumbling like a storm, staring out the window and convincing herself she was in control, that she could dance her way through one more crisis. Let that sink in. The woman who once made men forget their countries was about to be destroyed by hers. Turns out, being a spy requires more paperwork than passion. And she was about to learn that lesson the hard way. By 1917, Europe wasn't a continent anymore, it was a conspiracy board. Strings, rumors, coded messages, and paranoia stretched from one capital to another. Everyone suspected everyone. And somewhere in the middle of that giant, tangled mess sat Mata Hari. Part performer, part pawn, part pending headline. Her life had turned into one long improv routine where every audience member had a gun. She was writing letters to the French military about her progress, sending coded telegrams to her supposed German contacts, and somehow believing she could balance both without tripping over her own fiction. The irony? Most of what she sent was useless gossip, things overheard in hotel bars or made up on the spot. It was espionage as theater, a dazzling show with no plot. But the walls were closing in. The Germans, who had once called her Agent H-21, began to suspect she wasn't loyal to them. The French, led by her handler Ledoux, started to suspect she was a traitor. Everyone else? They just enjoyed the spectacle. The double agent dancer, the newspapers whispered, the woman who seduced nations. Except none of it was proven. The truth, inconvenient and unprofitable, was that Mata Hari didn't really know what she was doing. She wasn't a spy. She was a story pretending to be one. She'd been given codes she didn't understand, contacts she couldn't control, and a mission that sounded more like a fairy tale than strategy. The professionals around her, the real spies, the ones with fake names and dead friends, saw her as an amateur, maybe even a liability. And they weren't wrong. Her communication with both sides was intercepted by British intelligence, decoded, and passed along with enough red stamps and suspicion to set the whole thing on fire. The French now had evidence, or at least enough to stage a trial. But let's be honest, they didn't need proof. They needed a performance. While all this unfolded, Mata Hari kept traveling, still performing, still trying to stay one step ahead of the creditors and scandals. She stayed in luxury hotels when she could, lived off borrowed money when she couldn't, and kept charming anyone who would listen. Her beauty, still magnetic but fading, became her last currency. Imagine her in a train carriage, staring at her reflection in the window. The face looking back wasn't the goddess from the posters anymore. It was someone tired, someone who'd played the role too long and forgotten what the script was. The performance had swallowed the performer. It's tragic in a cinematic way. The woman who built her life on illusion finally couldn't tell the difference between disguise and self. In Madrid, she wrote Ledoux letters insisting her loyalty to France was pure. He didn't respond. She told friends she was being followed by invisible men. She wasn't wrong. Agents were tailing her everywhere, in hotel lobbies, train stations, even cafes. Every move she made added another paragraph to the file being built against her. Then came the final act of betrayal, though no one agrees who betrayed whom. In early 1917, German intelligence sent a coded message about Agent H21, the same code name they'd once used for Mata Hari. It was sent using an outdated cipher the French had already broken. In other words, they practically hand-delivered the noose. Historians still argue whether the Germans did it on purpose, throwing her to the wolves as a distraction, or whether it was just incompetence. Either way, the French intercepted the telegram, and that was all they needed. Confirmation, they said. Proof. Proof of what exactly was irrelevant. The headlines would write themselves. The seductive spy who sold France to Germany. She must have sensed the shift in the air, the way people started avoiding her, the way officials stopped smiling back. Her letters grew desperate. "I have done nothing wrong," she wrote. "If they accuse me, it will be a mistake or jealousy. And maybe that's the saddest part." Mata Hari had spent her entire life being misunderstood on purpose, creating mystery as a shield. But when the misunderstanding finally turned fatal, there was no performance left to save her. Her lovers disappeared. Her allies pretended not to know her. Even Ledoux, the man who'd recruited her, began framing her as a threat. To him, she was no longer an asset. She was a convenient scapegoat. France needed morale. France needed vengeance. And France needed a villain who wore silk instead of metals. Still, she didn't run. Maybe she thought her fame would protect her, that no one would dare execute Mata Hari. Or maybe she was just too exhausted to keep pretending. On February 13th, 1917, she checked into the Hotel Élysée Palace in Paris, one of her last illusions of glamour. She ordered breakfast, read the paper, applied her makeup. There was a knock at the door, and when she opened it, the men standing there weren't reporters or admirers. They were police. "Margaretha Zell," one said. "You're under arrest." She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, but the kind you give when life becomes too absurd to take seriously. The performance was over, but the legend, that was just beginning. By 1917, France needed a scapegoat, and Mata Hari was wearing the perfect mask. Paris, February 13th, 1917. The city was gray, damp, and exhausted, a reflection of a country that had been bleeding for 3 years straight. Inside room 131 of the Hotel Élysée Palace, Mata Hari sat at her vanity, brushing her hair with the deliberate calm of a woman who refused to let the world see her panic. The curtains were drawn, the perfume still fresh in the air, and the city outside was pretending not to fall apart. Then came the knock. Not a polite, hesitant one, the kind you expect from a waiter bringing croissants, but a firm, rhythmic pounding that made her freeze mid-stroke. She turned slowly, expecting a lover, maybe a messenger. But when she opened the door, she found not flowers, not letters, but French military police. "Margaretha Zell," the officer said, voice cold and formal. "You're under arrest on suspicion of espionage." Imagine that moment. The silence between accusation and understanding. The sound of her breath catching. The brush falling from her hand. The faintest trace of perfume still hanging in the air as her new reality stepped inside. She wasn't Mata Hari now. Just a woman in a silk robe surrounded by strangers who'd already decided what she was. The officers searched her room, turning over her belongings like archaeologists of scandal. Silk scarves, letters from admirers, a few travel documents, jewelry that might have been gifts or bribes, depending on who was telling the story. Every object became potential evidence. Even her mirror looked suspicious, as if it had been reflecting state secrets instead of vanity. They marched her through the hotel lobby. Guests stared. Staff whispered. The same city that once applauded her performances now watched her fall with voyeuristic satisfaction. Paris loves a rise, but it lives for a fall, especially one with feathers and eyeliner. She was taken to Saint Lazare prison, a crumbling fortress of despair better suited for criminals than courtesans. Her cell was cold, damp, and barely larger than a dressing room. Irony at its cruelest. The walls smelled of mildew and regret. Her bed was straw. Her view was a wall. For a woman who had lived her life in spotlight and luxury, it was like being buried alive. But even here, she performed. Guards later recalled how she carried herself with dignity. Brushing her hair, arranging her shawl, speaking softly, never begging. She demanded to see her lawyer, insisted on her innocence, and even asked for her favorite perfume. "If I am to be condemned," she said, "I'll go smelling of roses." The press got wind of her arrest almost immediately. Within days, every newspaper from Paris to New York had her name in bold. Mata Hari, the seductive spy, dancer turned double agent, the woman who betrayed France. It was the perfect story: scandal, sex, and state secrets. No one cared if it was true. Truth doesn't sell as well as fantasy, and Mata Hari had always been fantasy made flesh. She was accused of passing military secrets to the Germans, secrets that supposedly caused the deaths of thousands of French soldiers. The evidence? A few intercepted telegrams written in a code so vague it could have meant anything. But no one wanted facts. They wanted vengeance. And she was conveniently beautiful enough to blame. Ledoux, the very man who had recruited her, now played the role of righteous accuser. He fed the press lines about her treachery, painting her as a manipulative temptress who had seduced France's generals into betrayal. Never mind that. Most of her supposed targets denied even meeting her. Never mind that she was Dutch, not German, and had been trying badly to spy for France. None of it mattered. The public wanted blood, and France needed a symbol to prove its virtue. Inside the prison, Mata Hari tried to cling to some kind of logic. She wrote letters to her lawyer, to Ledoux, even to government officials, insisting she was innocent. Her words were elegant, composed, not the frantic scrawl of a guilty woman, but the careful handwriting of someone used to convincing others. "I am a dancer," she wrote. "I have loved men, yes, as all women do, but never for politics, only for love." There's a line somewhere between delusion and dignity, and she walked it perfectly. Her interrogators, however, were not impressed. They grilled her for hours, asking about every man she had ever spoken to, every trip, every letter, every dinner conversation. It became clear they weren't looking for truth. They were looking for a confession that fit the story already written. When she denied everything, they took her silence as cunning. When she explained, they took her words as manipulation. Every gesture, every breath became another piece of evidence. The woman who once made audiences believe anything was now being punished for the same gift. One interrogator later described her as calm, almost arrogant. Another called her naive and careless. Neither could decide whether she was a genius or a fool, and that contradiction made her even easier to condemn. Weeks passed. Spring arrived outside, but not in Saint Lazare. The newspapers feasted on her trial before it even began, each headline more outrageous than the last. Artists painted her as Eve, as Cleopatra, as a serpent in silk. The myth grew so large it smothered the woman beneath it, and still she kept her poise. Maybe it was defiance, maybe denial, or maybe it was just habit. After all, performing was the only thing she'd ever done perfectly. When she was finally told she'd stand trial for espionage, she nodded once and said quietly, "Then I will dance no more." Strange, the calm of that line, like she knew on some level that her story was already finished. The rest was just choreography. They didn't want justice. They wanted theater. And Mata Hari had always known how to give an audience exactly what it came for. They called it the trial of the century, though it was less a trial and more a Broadway tragedy, if Broadway had rifles instead of curtains. Paris, July 1917. The city was tired, angry, and terrified. French soldiers were dying in trenches by the thousands. Morale was collapsing, and anyone, needed to pay for it. Preferably someone glamorous, someone foreign, someone who looked good in headlines. Enter Mata Hari, the perfect villain. The courtroom itself was a stage. High ceilings, rows of journalists, military officers in pressed uniforms pretending to look impartial. And at the center, a woman in black, calm, poised, a faint trace of defiance in her eyes. It wasn't the calm of guilt or innocence. It was the calm of a performer who knows the show must go on. Her lawyer, Edouard Clunet, sat beside her looking like a man already composing her obituary. He wasn't exactly incompetent, just outmatched. The prosecution, led by Captain Pierre Bouchardon, came armed not with evidence but with emotion. His opening statement sounded less like an accusation and more like a sermon. This woman used her body to betray her country. Her kisses killed men. It was a beautiful line. It was also nonsense. There was no concrete proof. No photographs, no eyewitnesses, not even a reliable witness statement. The evidence was a handful of intercepted telegrams referring to a mysterious H-21, which the French insisted was Mata Hari. It didn't matter that there were other possible suspects. It didn't matter that the Germans themselves likely sent the message knowing the French could read it. Logic was irrelevant. The theater of vengeance had begun. Mata sat silently through most of it, her chin lifted, her gloves spotless. She didn't break down or cry or plead, and that, of course, was a problem. The court expected contrition, maybe even hysteria. Instead, they got composure, a woman who refused to crumble. And in 1917 France, a woman who didn't crumble was dangerous. At one point, Bouchardon waved a stack of her love letters like sacred relics. "See," he declared. She seduced officers and diplomats alike. She traded passion for secrets. The men in the room leaned forward, half scandalized, half entertained. Even in disgrace, she commanded attention. It was as if the very people judging her were still under her spell and hating her for it. Her defense tried to argue the obvious: that Mata Hari was a dancer, not a spy, that she exaggerated her importance to impress suitors, that she didn't even know most of the secrets she was accused of leaking. But the court didn't want nuance. They wanted narrative. And Mata Hari was the perfect narrative. A beautiful woman whose sensuality symbolized all the chaos France wanted to forget. Her alleged crimes became metaphors. Every lover was treason. Every glance, an encoded message. Every gesture, an act of seduction against the Republic. It was almost poetic how absurd it all was. A female journalist watching the trial wrote in her notes, "The court was transfixed, not by evidence, but by her presence. She looked like art. They looked like judges pretending to understand it." When it was her turn to speak, Mata rose. The courtroom fell silent. "I have loved men," she began, her Dutch accent soft but clear. "But I have never loved any one of them enough to betray my country." That line hung in the air, powerful, defiant. But in a room already hungry for blood, defiance was suicide. The judges whispered among themselves. The journalists scribbled furiously, trying to decide whether to describe her as tragic or depraved. Her lawyer pleaded for leniency. The prosecution smirked. It took the jury less than 40 minutes to decide her fate. Guilty. The sentence: death by firing squad. Even then, she didn't cry. She didn't shout or beg. She just nodded, as if acknowledging the end of a play she'd already rehearsed in her mind. Some said she smiled. Others swore she whispered something under her breath. A line, perhaps, meant only for herself. The irony was suffocating. France had accused her of espionage without a shred of solid proof. The real spies, the ones who had actually cost lives, would live long enough to read about her execution in the papers. But Mata Hari's death would look righteous, and in war optics are everything. After the verdict, she was taken back to Saint Lazare. Even her guards, hardened by years of prisoners, treated her with a strange reverence. They'd seen criminals, liars, murderers, but never a woman who accepted her death with such grace. She asked for paper and ink, writing her final letters with elegant loops, thanking her lawyer, forgiving her accusers, even requesting perfume for her last morning. "I am not afraid," she wrote, "because I have nothing to hide." Maybe she believed it. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she was simply too tired to care. And as she lay on her narrow bed that night, the city outside continued as usual. Soldiers marching, factories roaring, lovers quarreling. The same world that had watched her dance now prepared to watch her die. Because nothing says moral victory like shooting a dancer. The newspapers had already written their headlines. The audience was ready. The spotlight once again would be hers. The verdict was already written. The execution date was next. October 15th, 1917. Dawn crept into Paris like a nervous thief, gray, cold, and indifferent. Inside the walls of Vincennes prison, Mata Hari awoke for the last time. She didn't sleep much that night. Few people do when they know exactly what hour they're going to die. But when the guards came for her at 5 in the morning, she was already sitting up, dressed, composed. She had chosen her outfit with precision because of course she had. If this was to be her final act, it would be performed beautifully. Black velvet dress, a tailored hat pinned perfectly in place, gloves of white, immaculate. Even the commandant overseeing her execution would later admit, almost begrudgingly, that she looked magnificent. No tears, no panic, just poise. When the priest arrived, she refused confession. When they offered her a blindfold, she refused that too. "A dancer dies with her eyes open," she said, "and you have to admire the consistency." She'd been performing all her life. Why stop now? They led her across the courtyard to the execution field. The sky was overcast, the ground slick from last night's rain. 12 French soldiers waited in formation, rifles at the ready. A few journalists stood nearby, sketchpads in hand, hoping to capture the moment history demanded. Even death, it seemed, had a press section. As she stepped onto the dirt, her heels sank slightly. She paused, maybe to steady herself, maybe to make sure the image would last, and turned to face the firing squad. Her eyes, one witness said, were calm, almost curious. The officer in charge read out her sentence in a voice that cracked once, just barely. She nodded, lips parting ever so slightly, as if to say, "I know my lines." And then she smiled, a small, soft smile. Not of arrogance, not of mockery, but of acceptance. The kind of smile that says, if this is how it ends, then fine, at least make it beautiful. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The commandant raised his sword. Shoo! The rifles cracked as one. She fell slowly, gracefully, as though bowing after a performance. Knees folding first, body tilting backward. One of the soldiers swore later that she never made a sound. Another claimed she whispered something in Dutch just before the shots. Some even said she blew a kiss. But no one could agree. Maybe that's fitting. She'd always been more myth than woman. A sergeant stepped forward, his revolver trembling slightly, and fired a single shot to the heart. The customary coup de grace. The sound echoed against the prison walls, sharp and final. It was 6:15 a.m. The soldiers lowered their rifles. No one clapped. No one spoke. The officers turned away first, muttering that breakfast was waiting. The journalists scribbled furiously, already framing the story they'd send to the morning papers. The dancer who died for secrets. Her body was left lying there for a few minutes. Hat tilted to one side, black velvet darkened by mud. Someone, probably a guard, covered her with a sheet. And just like that, Mata Hari, the world's most infamous spy, ceased to exist. No family came to claim her body. No lover, no friend, no admirer. She was taken to a nearby hospital for autopsy, then quietly buried in an unmarked grave. Her head, reportedly, was sent to a museum in Paris for study. It later went missing, perhaps stolen, perhaps discarded. History's final insult. Even in death, her body was treated as a prop. But let's not end on anatomy. Let's stay in that moment. The courtyard, the silence, the absurd stillness after. Spectacle. Because here's the cruel poetry of it all. She was never really proven guilty. Not of treason. Not of espionage. The evidence that killed her would later be exposed as hearsay, exaggeration, or outright fabrication. But war doesn't wait for clarity. It feeds on closure. And Mata Hari was the perfect offering. Beautiful, foreign, and conveniently disposable. The French press called her a menace to the Republic. The German papers called her a fascinating fool. The British press just called her a story. None of them called her by her real name. Still, something about her composure lingered. The witnesses couldn't shake it. The woman who'd lived by illusion had met reality head-on. And somehow, reality had blinked first. Some performances end with applause, one guard later said. Others with silence. Hers ended with both. The silence of finality, the applause of history, and yet, death didn't kill her story. It only made her immortal, because within days her face was everywhere again. Painted, printed, whispered about. The world that killed her suddenly couldn't get enough of her. People argued whether she was a martyr or a monster, a saint or a liar. They reenacted her life on stage, wrote her into novels, dressed actresses in veils and called them Mata Hari. The woman was gone. The myth was just getting started. Let that sink in for a moment. She spent her whole life crafting an illusion to survive, and that illusion ended up outliving her. If you listen closely to old newsreels, you can almost hear the echo of her heels on that courtyard floor, the last rhythm of a woman who turned deception into art. And even now, more than a century later, we still can't quite tell whether she was guilty, or just too unforgettable to forgive. Some performances end with applause, others with silence. But hers? Hers never really ended at all. When the smoke cleared at Vincennes, France exhaled like it had just scratched an itch. Mata Hari was dead. Officially, decisively, conveniently. The firing squad went home for breakfast. The officers filed their reports, and Paris got a brand new villain to gossip about over coffee. It was done. Or at least it should have been. But if there's one thing history's good at, it's reanimating the dead, especially the beautiful ones. Within days, the myth of Mata Hari exploded across Europe. Her name was on every headline, every cigarette card, every whispered conversation in cafe corners. The papers couldn't agree on who she'd really been, but they didn't let that get in the way of a good story. To the French, she was a master manipulator, a witch in silk stockings who'd seduced the Republic itself. To the Germans, she was an overrated amateur, an entertainer who'd stumbled into espionage and paid the price. To the British, she was a tragic femme fatale, exotic enough to be blamed, foreign enough to be forgotten. But to the public, she was intoxicating. People devoured the drama. They cut out her photos, memorized her last words, and debated whether she really blew that kiss before the rifles fired. Artists painted her as a martyr of passion. Tabloids painted her as the devil in lace. Both sold equally well. It was the perfect legend. A woman too beautiful to live, too dangerous to die quietly. And the more the truth dissolved, the stronger the myth became. Mata Hari's life had always been a performance, but death gave it better lighting. The stage just got bigger. The props were history, the audience the entire world. In Paris, theaters immediately began staging inspired plays, thinly disguised rip-offs with names like The Scarlet Spy and The Dancer Who Betrayed an Empire. In Berlin, cabarets reenacted her execution as erotic spectacle, because of course they did. Even Hollywood got involved a decade later, turning her story into silent film tragedy. The actress playing her reportedly fainted during the mock execution scene. The audience called it realism. Everyone wanted a piece of her, even the governments that had condemned her. France quietly celebrated its victory, proof that justice had been done, that the Republic had purged its corruption. Germany rolled its eyes but didn't complain. One less distraction from their own failures. Nobody cared that she had been little more than a scapegoat with a good wardrobe. That's the thing about myth-making. Once a story starts selling, nobody bothers checking the receipts. And in death, Mata Hari became whatever people needed her to be. To feminists of the 1920s, she was a victim of patriarchal paranoia, a woman punished for daring to live boldly in a man's war. To cynics, she was the original influencer, proof that performance could be power. To conspiracy theorists, she was still alive somewhere, drinking champagne under a new name, watching the world argue over her ghost. Each version was partly true and entirely false, because the real Mata Hari, the girl who grew up in Leeuwarden, the woman who lost her child in the Indies, the performer who danced to survive, she vanished long before the firing squad ever aimed their rifles. What remained was narrative, and narratives are immortal. Even decades later, when declassified files finally emerged showing the absurd weakness of her case, people didn't want to believe it. The truth was too boring. The idea that she'd been framed, that she'd never actually passed any meaningful secrets, that she'd died mostly for drama. It felt wrong. Audiences don't come for tragedy that's unjustified. They come for tragedy that feels earned. And so the legend stayed. In cafes, older men bragged that they'd once danced with her. Younger women copied her style. The scarves, the dark eyeliner, the mysterious smiles. Writers compared her to Cleopatra, Delilah, Eve. You could almost hear the unspoken warning in every retelling. This is what happens when a woman becomes too powerful at the wrong time. But there was also admiration, a quiet one. Even among her critics, there was a sense that she'd outsmarted them all by refusing to die small. She turned her downfall into a finale that could never be forgotten. Some said her ghost haunted the theaters where she once performed. Others claimed her spirit lingered in hotel rooms, whispering secrets in the dark. Maybe that's poetic nonsense, or maybe it's fitting. After all, ghosts are just stories that refuse to stay buried. There's something human in that, isn't there? The way we romanticize ruin. We take broken people, wrap them in mystery, and call it legacy. Mata Hari wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. Marilyn Monroe, Amy Winehouse, countless others. The world loves women who burn too brightly and then asks why they caught fire. A century later, historians would dig through the archives and realize the scope of the fabrication. How little the evidence mattered. How her name had been passed around as political theater, her guilt staged like one of her old performances. And still, no one could undo the spell. Because by then, the myth had a life of its own. She wasn't Margaretha Zell anymore, not even Mata Hari the performer. She was an archetype, a symbol, the seductive spy, the doomed enchantress, the woman who danced her way into the crossfire of history. And maybe, in some twisted way, that's what she always wanted, to be unforgettable. Paris moved on, as it always does. The war ended. The soldiers returned home. The city rebuilt its illusions. But every so often, when the lights dimmed in the cabarets, someone would whisper her name, half in awe, half in fear, because legends don't die. They just learn to pose better for the camera. It's the same cycle we see today. Controversy is the fastest route to immortality. And Mata Hari, she didn't just understand that rule. She invented it. History is full of bad magic tricks, and Mata Hari's espionage was one of the worst. For decades, her name was synonymous with betrayal. The woman who caused the deaths of 50,000 French soldiers. The courtesan who sold the Republic for cash and kisses. It was cinematic, scandalous, and completely wrong. Because here's the twist. Mata Hari was never a real spy. Not in the James Bond sense. Not even in the mildly competent intern with a notebook sense. She wasn't decoding maps or passing blueprints hidden in fans. She didn't even understand the ciphers people kept accusing her of using. The secrets she supposedly leaked? Half were gossip, the rest were fantasy. And it took 50 years for the truth to crawl out from the archives. In the 1950s and 60s, after enough time had passed for everyone involved to die, or pretend they didn't remember, governments finally started releasing classified documents. French military files, German war logs, the works. Historians expecting pages of espionage brilliance instead found paperwork that read like a bad romantic comedy. Telegrams, receipts, and notes that basically said, "We think she might be talking to someone important. Probably. Maybe." Even the infamous German telegram identifying Agent H21, the one that got her killed, turned out to be a bluff. The Germans had used a broken code the French could already read. Translation: they wanted her name to be seen. She was a decoy, a smokescreen, the perfect patsy in an era when everyone was trying to look like they were winning. Meanwhile, the French were desperate for a headline that didn't start with catastrophe at the front. A glamorous spy trial? Now that would sell newspapers. It didn't matter that the evidence was thinner than her costumes. France needed closure, not accuracy. The newly released files revealed how absurdly staged her case was. The judges had met before the trial to agree on her guilt. Her lawyer was denied access to most of the supposed evidence. The key witnesses contradicted themselves so often you'd think they were improvising. One officer even admitted afterward that the whole thing was morally necessary. Translation: We needed a scapegoat who looked good in ink, and boy did she. When journalists later reviewed the transcripts, they realized the prosecution had spent more time describing her clothes and perfume than her actual crimes. A military tribunal trying a war criminal had turned into a gossip column. One newspaper joked that her trial was half courtroom, half fashion show. It wasn't far off. So what did she really do? She flirted. She traveled. She talked to men who shouldn't have been talking to her. And yes, she took money from multiple sides, sometimes for information, sometimes just for company. But espionage? No. She was an opportunist, not an operator. Her biggest mistake wasn't treason, it was confidence. She believed she could play the world's most dangerous game without reading the rules. And the world, predictably, punished her for overestimating her importance. The irony is brutal. The same qualities that made her famous, mystery, charm, the ability to make men feel like they mattered, were reinterpreted as weapons. Every smile became a coded signal. Every trip, a mission. Every man she touched, a victim. It's almost poetic how much the system overestimated her. They thought she was an international mastermind, while she was just trying to survive another winter without pawning her jewelry. But here's the haunting part. She believed the story too. Toward the end, when she wrote to her lawyer insisting she was innocent, she also claimed to have been a loyal agent for France. The truth had become so blurred that even she wasn't sure which version of herself to defend. And maybe that's what makes her story timeless. It's not about espionage at all. It's about how easily stories become weapons. How one narrative, repeated enough, can overwrite an entire life. Think about it. She wasn't executed for her actions. She was executed for her reputation. A century later, social media does the same thing. Cancel culture before hashtags existed. The court of public opinion hasn't evolved much. It's just faster now. When the declassified reports hit the public in the 1970s, the collective reaction was a mix of shock and embarrassment. Wait, she was innocent? We killed a dancer for PR? Do we apologize? Spoiler, they didn't. Governments don't do apologies. They do anniversaries and documentaries. Historians tried to rehabilitate her image, calling her a victim of hysteria and hypocrisy. Feminists in the 80s reframed her as a symbol of how women's sexuality gets criminalized whenever men panic. Even the French army, decades later, quietly admitted there was no material evidence of treason, which, when translated from bureaucraties, means, oops. Still, her legend remained juicier than her innocence. The myth of the seductive spy had already entered the bloodstream of pop culture. She'd inspired novels, operas, movies, everything from serious biopics to pulp thrillers. The truth couldn't compete with the fantasy she'd accidentally created. And honestly, that's probably how she would have wanted it. Because while she may not have been a real spy, she understood something deeper, that perception is power. People believed she was dangerous, and that belief alone reshaped nations. The fact that it killed her is tragic, sure, but it also made her immortal. Imagine her ghost reading those declassified files. All the men debating whether she was a villain or a victim. All the experts confessing there'd never been proof. You can almost picture her smirking, maybe whispering, "Took you long enough." She never got justice, but she got something better, permanence. Her name outlived her judges, her accusers, and the empire that killed her. And maybe that's the real secret history kept. Not the coded messages, not the espionage files, but the fact that a woman with no weapons and no training managed to terrify governments just by being unforgettable. So yes, she died a spy, but not because she was one, because she was too interesting not to be. Imagine dying because someone misread your fan mail. So was she a liar, or just too interesting to live? If history loves anything, it's a woman it can misunderstand forever. And Mata Hari, dead, mythologized, and conveniently mute, was tailor-made for cinematic resurrection. You can almost see the montage. Reels of her dancing projected over grainy war footage, newspapers spinning across the screen, some dramatic narrator intoning. She danced her way into the hearts of men and the secrets of empires. The world didn't just forgive her, It franchised her. Hollywood got there first. By the 1930s, studios smelled profit in tragedy. Greta Garbo, all cheekbones and mystery, played her in Mata Hari, 1931. The movie turned the story into glossy melodrama. Spy plots, doomed romance, a kiss before the firing squad. It was about as accurate as a history book written by a perfume commercial, but audiences adored it. In America's imagination, Mata Hari became the ultimate femme fatale, a woman whose beauty could dismantle armies. And isn't that what everyone secretly wanted? The idea that chaos could wear lipstick? From there, she became an archetype. The dangerous woman, the temptress, the secret agent with a dagger smile. You see her in every Bond girl who ever smirked while loading a pistol, in every film noir siren who flicked her cigarette and whispered, "You'll never catch me." That's Mata Hari's real espionage. She infiltrated culture. But it's funny, most people don't realize how inverted her myth really is. In fiction, the femme fatale is in control, always a step ahead, always pulling the strings. In reality, Mata Hari was the opposite. The strings pulled her. She was being played by men from both sides of the war, by governments, by the press, even by her own myth. Yet she became the blueprint for control, confidence, and manipulation. That's the delicious hypocrisy of it all. The woman destroyed for being too visible is remembered as the symbol of power. Let's pause on that irony for a second. The same courts that called her deceitful, immoral, and hysterical created the cultural obsession that made her immortal. They killed her body but preserved her image, a paradox wrapped in silk. After the war, fashion houses sold Mata Hari perfumes. There were novels titled The Red Dancer, The Spy Who Loved Death, The Kiss of Mata Hari. Every writer and director wanted to project their own fantasy onto her. To men, she was the eternal seductress. To women, she was a cautionary tale and a liberation fantasy all at once. You could hate her, envy her, imitate her, and history had room for all three. Even intelligence agencies used her name as shorthand for any woman accused of espionage. During the Cold War, every female operative caught in scandal got dubbed the new Mata Hari. It became less a name and more a job title. The woman herself faded further into fiction with every repetition. And yet, there's something fascinating about how she still refuses to settle into just one box. Each generation reinvents her. In the 60s, she was seen as a misunderstood proto-feminist, a woman punished for daring to be sexually autonomous in a time when that was a sin. In the 80s, she was reclaimed as a symbol of media exploitation. Today, she'd probably have a Netflix docuseries, a think piece about misogyny in wartime propaganda, and at least one ironic merch line, #dance too close to the truth. We'd tweet about her for a week and move on. But let's not pretend we'd treat her any better now. Even today, a woman who plays with perception, who manipulates her own image, who dares to be both alluring and ambitious, is treated like she's hiding something. The world hasn't changed much. It's just digitized its pitchforks. Mata Hari would have thrived on Instagram, though. Think about it. The veils, the elaborate captions about divine femininity. The mystery of a woman posting from hotels across Europe. She'd be the original influencer, her DMs full of diplomats. And when the scandal hit, because it always does, hashtags would trend, people would cancel her, and 2 weeks later Netflix would announce the Mata Hari scandal, a 5-part limited series. We pretend we've evolved, but really we've just added better filters. What keeps her relevant isn't just beauty or tragedy. It's the duality. She's everything people fear in a powerful woman. Independent but seductive, clever but emotional, strong but doomed. She represents that razor-thin line between admiration and destruction. Every generation projects its anxieties onto her. She's the mirror that reflects how we still don't know what to do with women who won't fit into neat categories. And maybe that's her greatest trick. She didn't just live through performance. She made performance her legacy. Her myth outlasted every empire that condemned her. The real Mata Hari might have been messy, lost, and scared, but the idea of Mata Hari, untouchable, eternal, in a strange way she won, because she became a story no one could stop telling. It's strange how the people who fake it best often feel the most unseen. And that's the paradox that keeps her ghost alive. She built herself out of illusion to survive, and now illusion is all we remember. She's the goddess of performance, the patron saint of misunderstood ambition, the dancer who taught history how to stare. And though her body was buried in anonymity, her shadow still moves whenever someone says the words femme fatale. It's not espionage anymore. It's art. And Mata Hari is still dancing. There's a cruel kind of genius in how the world remembers Mata Hari. We turned her into a symbol of deception, then forgot who deceived whom. Was she the liar, or just the lie everyone agreed to believe? It's almost poetic that her greatest illusion wasn't performed on stage, but in the court of history. Because behind the veils, the scandal, the weaponized charm, was someone much simpler. A woman trying to survive in a man's war, using the only power she was ever allowed to have. And that might be the darkest magic trick of all. Convincing the world that survival is seduction. She didn't invent illusion. She just mastered it before it mastered her. Let's rewind for a second. Picture Europe at the turn of the 20th century, painted in opulence and hypocrisy. Men built empires and named them after themselves, while women were expected to decorate those empires like wallpaper. Charm was a skill, obedience an art form. If a woman wanted power, she had to disguise it as beauty. Mata Hari understood that rule better than anyone. She wasn't trying to be dangerous. She was trying to be noticed. The tragedy is that being noticed was enough to make her dangerous. Every glance she gave was reinterpreted. Every performance politicized. Every man who failed her repainted the story to make himself look noble. And when history finally wrote her down, it did so in men's handwriting. Even her myth, her supposed power, was defined by male fear. That's the real espionage here. Not the coded telegrams or whispered secrets, but the way perception becomes control. The way truth can be framed, edited, and sold until it no longer belongs to the person who lived it. Mata Hari didn't die because she was a spy. She died because she was a narrative threat. When France shot her, they weren't executing a woman. They were executing ambiguity. They needed the comfort of a villain, and she was too vivid, too complex to be anything else. It's easier to kill a symbol than confront a system. But let's not crown her as a saint either. She played the game. She lied when it helped, seduced when it paid, and believed her own legend long after it became dangerous. Her downfall wasn't just bad luck. It was hubris. She thought she could manipulate chaos without becoming part of it. But when you dance on quicksand, grace doesn't save you. Timing does, and hers ran out. Still, there's something profound about her story's endurance. Because underneath the tragedy lies a warning, and maybe even a mirror. We still live in a world obsessed with illusion, where appearance often outweighs truth. Politicians stage authenticity. Celebrities curate imperfection. Even ordinary people perform versions of themselves for invisible audiences. Scroll through social media and you'll find 1,000 Mata Haris, each dancing for validation, each one building an identity out of what others want to see. The platforms have changed, but the performance hasn't. Let that sink in for a second. In a sense, we've all become our own spies, collecting attention, concealing vulnerability, coding emotions into aesthetic language. The currency's different now, but the economy of illusion is thriving. That's what makes her story timeless. Not the scandal, not the espionage, but the lesson hidden beneath the velvet. That power built on perception can both elevate and destroy. It's fragile, addictive, and always costs more than you expect to pay. If Mata Hari lived today, she'd be both worshipped and devoured. Her mystery would trend for 24 hours, dissected by podcasts and documentaries. Half the internet would call her an icon of feminine agency. The other half would call her manipulative and fake. And both sides would miss the point completely. Because Mata Hari wasn't the problem. She was the mirror. A mirror reflecting the insecurities of a world that couldn't handle women who define themselves. A mirror that still unsettles us because it forces the question, who gets to control the story? The person living it or the people watching? When you strip away the myth, all that remains is a woman who refused to play small. who crafted a persona to outrun mediocrity, and for a while succeeded. She built herself from smoke and silk, and even when the world tore it apart, she left fingerprints on the glass. Maybe that's her real legacy, not the espionage or execution, but the audacity to perform life as art. A century later, we still punish women for performing confidence too well. We still confuse charisma with danger, independence with guilt. We still love watching a rise almost as much as we love watching a fall. So the next time someone tells her story with a smirk or a shrug, remember this: the difference between myth and truth isn't fact. It's comfort. And comfort has never been part of her choreography. She remains suspended in history like a half-finished performance. Part muse, part ghost, part warning. The dancer who showed us how fragile reputation is, and how easily we mistake illusion for intent. Because maybe that's the real espionage, pretending we've changed. Time has a funny way of forgiving what it can profit from. 20 years after Mata Hari's death, the same city that once called her a monster began to whisper her name again. This time softer, almost tenderly, like a confession it didn't want to admit aloud. Paris, that grand theater of sin and sentimentality, had found a new obsession: nostalgia. By the 1930s, cabaret was fashionable again. The war was over, the cafes were buzzing, and everyone wanted to forget that they'd once burned people for dancing. And who better to resurrect than the woman who turned dancing into legend? Posters appeared on walls. The true story of Mata Hari. Theater producers milked her myth with fresh lipstick and newer lies. Critics praised her as misunderstood, conveniently forgetting they'd called for her execution 20 years earlier. It was as if Paris itself had developed selective amnesia. The city that condemned her now wanted to claim her, to own her memory. Her old haunts became holy ground for the curious. The Gué Met Museum, where she'd performed her so-called sacred temple dances, was suddenly flooded with tourists. The cafes where she'd met generals and journalists were pointed out like crime scenes with style. Even the Hotel Élysée Palace, the place of her arrest, began to carry a faint glamour again, as if the memory of her perfume still clung to its curtains. And in some way, maybe it did. Paris has always thrived on ghosts. It doesn't erase them. It decorates them. It keeps them alive through stories, gossip, and candlelight. Every century, the city picks a few of its dead and recasts them as icons. Some get statues, others get scandals. Mata Hari got both. In 1934, a playwright staged The Spy Dancer, a thinly veiled retelling of her story. Audiences loved it, not for its accuracy, but for its romance. The play painted her as a misunderstood lover, doomed by cruel men and crueler fate. It was an apology disguised as art, which, if we're honest, is how Paris always apologizes. As the decades rolled on, the narrative softened. Historians started poking holes in the official story, uncovering the absurd inconsistencies in her trial. Even her old enemies began to admit, reluctantly, that maybe, just maybe, they'd executed the wrong person. But by then, the damage had already been immortalized in ink and film. The myth was untouchable, the truth irrelevant. Still, something remarkable happened. Artists began reclaiming her not as a villain, but as a muse. Painters captured her in flowing silk and shadow. Writers used her as shorthand for tragedy wrapped in beauty. Feminists reinterpreted her as an early casualty of patriarchal paranoia, a woman condemned for the crime of being irresistible and independent. She became the city's shared secret. Everyone knew she'd been wronged, but no one wanted to talk about how easily they'd all believed it. And maybe that's why Paris remembers her so vividly. Not because it wants to honor her, but because it needs to, because her ghost reminds the city of what it's capable of, both the beauty and the brutality. Walk through Montmartre at night, and you'll still hear it, the whisper of silk, the echo of heels on cobblestone. Some swear they've seen her reflection in the mirrors of old theaters, not as a specter of revenge, but as a woman watching herself being remembered, bemused, elegant, faintly amused by how everyone still gets her wrong. It's said that, on the centenary of her death, a handful of historians visited the courtyard at Vincennes, the spot where she fell. They brought flowers and placed them quietly on the ground, right where the earth dips slightly from the rain and the weight of time. There's no plaque, no marker, just dirt, wind, and a silence that feels like guilt trying to look poetic. Paris forgives its mistakes in style. It always has. But forgiveness is not the same as justice. Maybe that's the real legacy of Mata Hari in the city she once owned with her eyes. Every building that bore witness to her rise and fall still stands, indifferent yet shimmering with her ghost light. The Guillemette, the Folies Bergère, the prison walls at Saint-Lazare. They are reminders that beauty and punishment often share the same stage, and applause can turn into accusation overnight. If you ever visit her places, try standing still for a moment. Let the city breathe around you. You'll feel it, the thin veil between then and now, between admiration and betrayal. Paris remembers even when it pretends not to, because beneath the cobblestones and perfume, it still carries her in its bones. The city killed her, buried her, then crowned her in myth, all in one lifetime. It's poetic, tragic, and very on-brand for Paris. So yes, she's still here, not in flesh or fame, but in the way her story lingers, half warning, half lullaby. A dancer who refused to die quietly, and a city that couldn't look away. History doesn't remember the truth. It remembers the best story. And Mata Hari, for better or worse, gave it one hell of a story. By now, the name Mata Hari feels less like a person and more like a perfume bottle you find in an antique shop. Elegant, mysterious, and just a little sad. Everyone knows the silhouette, but almost no one remembers the scent of the person who once filled it. Behind the myth, behind the veils and scandals, there was still Margaretha Zell, the woman trying to make sense of herself in a world that loved her illusions but never her truth. Let's peel back that last veil for a moment. Before the stages and the uniforms, before the headlines and the gunfire, she was just a Dutch girl who wanted to be seen. That's it. That's the real engine beneath all the tragedy. The hunger to matter, to take up space in a world that told her not to. When her father went bankrupt and vanished, when her husband turned violent, when her child died, the universe seemed to be sending a very clear message. Stay small, stay quiet, stay ordinary. And she refused. That refusal, that rebellion, became her survival instinct. She learned early that power wasn't inherited. It was performed. So she built herself like an artwork. She chose her own name, her own origin story, even her own religion. If the world wouldn't love the real Margaretha, maybe it would worship the woman she invented. It worked, for a while. But the trouble with living through invention is that eventually, you start forgetting what parts of you were real. By the time she became famous, even she couldn't tell where the performance ended and the person began. It's easy to scoff at her now, the vanity, the exaggeration, the lies. But honestly, who among us doesn't curate our own version of reality? She just did it before filters and Wi-Fi. There's a certain empathy hidden in her downfall, because under all the spectacle was someone deeply lonely. Not glamorous lonely, but quiet lonely. The kind where you start performing even for yourself. Letters from her final months show flashes of the woman she once was. Tired, hopeful, still trying to believe she could charm fate into giving her one more act. She wrote to her lawyer that she longed for a small home, far away from war, where no one knows my name. Imagine that. The woman who once made the world whisper her name begging to be anonymous. She'd spent her whole life trying to be unforgettable. And in the end, all she wanted was peace. That's the cruel paradox of fame, isn't it? Promises escape but delivers exposure. And once you've lived as a symbol, it's almost impossible to go back to being human again. In her, we see a warning disguised as beauty, the danger of confusing validation with love. Her lovers adored her, but none of them knew her. The crowd worshipped her, but no one stayed when the lights went out. She crafted an identity so magnetic it repelled intimacy. Every gesture was flawless and utterly hollow. Maybe that's why her final act felt so strangely calm. Because by the time she faced those rifles, she had nothing left to perform. No lies to uphold. No applause left to chase. In that one last moment, standing straight, refusing the blindfold, looking her executioners in the eye, she was more herself than she had been in years. It's chilling, but also freeing. The woman who'd lived by illusion died in absolute truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was her real victory. When you strip away the layers of myth, she wasn't a seductress or a spy or even a victim. She was just someone trying to rewrite her own narrative in a time that wouldn't let women do that. And that's why her story still hums under our skin a century later. Because we recognize her. We see her in the influencers chasing algorithms, in the celebrities surviving scandals, in the people reinventing themselves online every few years. We're all curating our own masks, praying they'll save us, or at least make us more interesting. But the masks don't last. They never do. And Mata Hari's story whispers a reminder from behind the glass of history. Sooner or later, you have to meet the world with your eyes uncovered. Let that sink in. The real tragedy isn't that she died. It's that the world never saw her before she did. When the French finally released her case files decades later, people were shocked by how ordinary her handwriting was. No secret codes, no grand confessions. Just human vulnerability dressed up in beautiful loops and flourishes. It's strange, isn't it? How even her penmanship tried to look elegant, even when the words beneath it trembled. But that's her legacy, the poetry of contradiction. The woman who lied to survive yet died telling the truth. The dancer who fooled the world and then refused to flinch when it shot her. The artist who became her own creation and was punished for being too convincing. And maybe that's why she lingers, century after century, not as a ghost, but as a mirror. Because every time we look at her story, we see a piece of ourselves looking back. The ambition, the loneliness, the performance. She died as Mata Hari, but she began as Margaretha Zell, a woman who wanted to be loved and ended up remembered. And maybe that's the closest thing to immortality anyone can ask for. Let that sink in. When Margaretha Zell invented her alter ego, she chose the name Mata Hari, the eye of the day. It sounded spiritual, mysterious, divine, but it was also heartbreakingly literal. She wanted to be seen. The name itself was a wish, a plea for light in a life that had spent too much time in shadow. And maybe that's why her story still glows in the dark. More than a century later, the legend of Mata Hari still flickers. In old movie reels, in the pages of spy novels, in the collective imagination of anyone who loves a beautiful tragedy. But beyond the myth, beyond the soft-focused glamour and Hollywood exaggeration, there's something hauntingly human about her arc. She lived and died like a metaphor for what happens when illusion outpaces truth. The sun, after all, doesn't just illuminate, it burns. Imagine her now, if you can, not as the doomed femme fatale, not as the caricatured spy of sin, but as a woman standing at the threshold of dawn. She once said she wanted to be a woman who could do as men do without being condemned. And that, right there, is the core of it. She wasn't killed for secrets. She was killed for audacity, for refusing to be invisible. She wanted freedom in a century that barely gave women permission to breathe. She wanted love but refused to beg for it. She wanted to exist on her own terms, and that, perhaps, was the greatest espionage of all. Because in a world built on control, authenticity is rebellion. Every era needs its scapegoats, its martyrs, its icons. The beauty of Mata Hari's story is that she somehow became all three: a liar, a legend, and a lesson. She reminds us that identity is a performance we're all forced to audition for, and truth is the script we keep rewriting to survive. When historians finally re-examined her case, many called for her exoneration. Even the French Ministry of Defense admitted, in bureaucratic understatement, that there was no definitive evidence she was guilty of espionage. It was as close to an apology as governments ever get. But absolution came too late. The myth had already outlived the woman by decades. And maybe that's how she wins in the end. Because immortality doesn't require justice. It requires curiosity, and she still has ours. There's something eternal about how her story loops through time, every generation discovering her anew, reinventing her, projecting its own desires and fears onto her face. She's been villain, hero, feminist icon, and tragic fool. She's whatever the moment needs her to be. And that's the cruel beauty of legends. They never stop working. But let's look closer. Past the stories. Past the filters. Past the polished Hollywood versions that made her look like she woke up in perfect eyeliner. Let's imagine her instead in her quieter moments. Staring out the window of a rented hotel room, hair unpinned, writing letters no one would ever read. Maybe humming to herself. Maybe thinking of her daughter. Maybe wondering if she could ever go home again. Those are the images that don't make it into the movies. The ones that remind us she was real. It's easy to romanticize the performance. Harder to sit with the pain that built it. The glamour was never free. Every jewel, every dance, every whispered name came at a cost. Paid not in money, but in identity. And yet, there's grace in the way she carried it. Even at her worst, even at her most desperate, Mata Hari never let the world see her crawl. She met death like a queen, or maybe like a woman finally too tired to act. Either way, she left the stage on her own terms. That's why she endures. Because we're not fascinated by her crimes. We're fascinated by her composure. The real secret of Mata Hari isn't what she did. It's how she did it. With style, with defiance, with the haunting awareness that the audience was always watching. She understood something that still terrifies us today. That the line between who you are and who you pretend to be can vanish faster than a spotlight fades. And yet she leaned into it. Maybe that's what she meant by eye of the day. She wasn't just naming herself after the sun. She was naming herself after its paradox. The way it exposes everything, including itself. The way it makes beauty and destruction inseparable. The way it dies every night and rises again anyway. That's her legacy. Mata Hari was destroyed by perception but reborn through it too. She became a myth not because she wanted to, but because the world needs myths, stories to pin its contradictions on. We invented her to explain our own unease with power, desire, and performance. And maybe that's why, even now, her legend still feels alive. Because somewhere deep down, every one of us understands what it means to perform for survival. To build versions of ourselves that look stronger than we feel. To long for applause but fear exposure. That's the tragedy and brilliance of being human. We're all dancing for the light, even when it burns us. So tonight, if you remember her, don't remember the spy or the scandal. Remember the woman who refused the blindfold. Remember the girl who looked at her broken life and said, I can make something beautiful out of this. She did. She became the eye of the day, the light and the lie, the warmth and the warning. And maybe that's the truth she wanted us to find all along. If you've made it this far, you've looked straight into the eye of the day. Hit subscribe not for the myth, but for the meaning behind it. Because stories like Mata Hari's remind us that even the brightest lights cast the deepest shadows. Sleep well, and remember, every legend starts with someone simply refusing to stay ordinary.